Welcome everyone to today's webinar, How to Optimize Stock Take or Cycle Counts. Thank you for joining us. My name is Mackenzie Stang and I am the Digital Marketing Specialist here at RightSoft and will be helping to moderate today's session. For those of you not familiar with RightSoft, we are the developer of the RightSCAN mobile warehouse management system for Cispro and RightTime, which is simple time tracking software built specifically for manufacturers. Our presenter today is Implementation and Support Specialist Ryan Winnicky. Ryan leverages his computer systems and business administration degree from Bemidji State University to help customers and partners deploy software solutions that automate and optimize warehouse and manufacturing processes. At the end of the webinar, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions, so feel free to submit your questions via the chat window at any time during the webinar. If you have any technical issues, you can let us know via the chat window as well. This webinar will last about 30 minutes, followed by 5 to 10 minutes for questions. The webinar will be recorded, and we will email you a link to the recorded webinar later this week. We've got a lot to cover in the next 30 minutes, so let's get started. I'm going to hand it back over to Ryan.
Thank you very much, Mackenzie, and I hope everyone out there is staying safe and healthy as we go through all of these uncertain times throughout the globe. So what we'll be talking about today is going through what those manual inventory entries cost your business, how to create those standard inventory processes with a system, and then how to also label your warehouse and what some of those parameters are. Then we'll also go through the steps to really automate your stock take process and talk about some of those customer stories and what were some of the results they've seen from going through this process as well. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started. So while on average, inventory accounts for about 15% of US public firms' assets, there's a number of costs that often go overlooked when it comes to inventory management as well. The manual data entry process often results in incorrect inventory information. On average, humans make one error for about every 300 characters. So if you can think of all the manual typing when you have manual entry processes, this leads to inaccurate inventory levels, causing unnecessary reorders, potential stockouts as well. Another drawback is the amount of time that it takes to enter that data manually. And the time lag in accessing that updated information could be anything from an hour to a day or a week to do those manual processes and have up-to-date data. Ultimately, inventory inaccuracies are going to bloat your inventory levels and increase your warehouse space requirements. This ties up capital, impacts your ability to innovate or grow your business in today's increasingly lean market, as well as a very competitive global market. The inaccuracies inherently in manual inventories can lead to stockouts, mispicks, unhappy customers, as well as frustrated employees, which often goes overlooked as well. And in today's labor market, hanging on to good employees is critical, and having good processes for those employees is also critical. At the end of the day, all of these impact your bottom line of your business. And using a simple warehouse management software with barcodes can really help eliminate these mistakes, prevent those mispicks. If you're implementing lot traceability, it's going to help with those processes and also streamline your stock take processes. So the most important step you can take to achieve a more accurate inventory and future stock take or cycle count processes is to consistently label your warehouse and your inventory. A number of manufacturers have not yet barcode labeled their inventory yet. Some have, but we're going to talk about what are the 4 key steps to getting started with that. The first step in the process is defining the data that's required for your labels. What information do you need to collect or display internally or externally as products are shipped to customers? Most commonly, you're going to see the stock code description, a lot number, and quantity on a standard barcode, but your business may have other certain parameters that you want included on those labels as well. The next step is defining your label format of how is the data going to be organized on your label. What type or size label are you planning to use? This can be very dependent on the product that you're having to put those labels on, whether it's metal or foods or pallets, whatever that might be. They all go into consideration with that. You're also going to need to define which pieces of data need to be barcoded versus just need to be text displayed on that label. Are you planning to use 1D barcodes or 2D barcodes as well on those labels? Today, you can create 2D barcodes that contain multiple pieces of data of information such as your stock code, your lot number, and your quantity. And this simplifies and expedites the scanning process because they're all in one single barcode. The warehouse operator can then capture all three pieces of that information in a single scan versus scanning multiple times. All of these factors that we just kind of talked about really play a key role in deciding how are you going to format those labels and what do those labels look like throughout your organization. One of the most often asked questions I get when working with a customer that hasn't barcode labeled their inventory yet is, where do we start to get inventory labeled? You might be thinking, I have multiple warehouses, all kinds of stock codes throughout my warehouse. How do we go about getting these items labeled? And there's a few different approaches that companies take to going about that and getting their existing and new inventory labeled correctly so it can be consumed downstream. The first option is labeling items as they come into inventory, whether that be in your receiving area or your job receiving area. This is a much slower solution to implement, and it takes a while to turn that inventory to be able to effectively implement, but it's also the lowest impact to your business. You start to do those processes that you're going to have to do in the future anyways, and start to establish those labels throughout your organization. The second way of approaching labeling your inventory is picking batches or selecting some sort of parameters for how you're going to go about labeling each area of your inventory. This could be based on, I'm going to label X bins per week, or I'm going to label these section of stock codes this week, and doing it in those batches. So that way you can slowly start to relabel all of your inventory that you have in a much more effective way, and then still label those items as they're coming in your door, receiving those finished goods. The last sort of option that some customers choose to approach is tying their relabeling process with a stock take, whether it's an annual stock take or a separate full stock take that you set up. And what this allows them to do is they're relabeling all of their products with their labels they're going to use going forward while they're doing that stock take at once. Now, there's a couple of pros and cons, and I've actually got to be a part of this actual situation with customers on the floor, and you start to see some of those benefits and negatives to this. You know, on the bright side, with taking this strategy, you're knocking it all out at once, and it allows you to move forward as an organization. If you're going to be doing that stock take already, it allows you to label that inventory as everyone's going through it and get those labels correctly on your products for your whole warehouse. On the downside, we all know how busy a stock take is. If you're doing it manually already today with manual pick tickets, you know how many things are going on, and now you're adding one more thing to that list of items. But on the bright side, you get it all done at once as well. So there's positives and negatives to think about with that workflow of relabeling your warehouse and all of your products. So the last thing we want to talk about is actually enforcing those labeling process and getting started with that. So now that you've chose a way to get your existing inventory labeled, you also need to define what those standard processes are for labeling that incoming inventory for both raw materials and finished goods. You want to define those process points within your organization at how those products are going to be labeled or relabeled. And one of the other key things that often goes overlooked is, don't forget to think about labeling your warehouse and your locations. If you're multi-bin, especially if you're using multiple bins in Syspro, having all of those bin locations also barcoded is just as important as all of the stock codes. One of the other questions we often receive is in regards to using supplier labels. So you might be receiving products from your supplier that are already labeled and they're already barcoded, and you want to know, can you just use that instead of having to reprint new labels for each of these processes. And there's a few good questions that help us better understand and guide us through whether supplier labels are the right decision for my organization or not. The first question I like to ask is, do you have control over the labels that your suppliers are sending you? Are you able to provide them input as to what they're putting on that barcode label that's being sent to you? And then the second question to that is, have you set up supplier cross-references in Syspro? If you're not familiar with supplier cross-references, it's the ability to link a stock code from one of your supplier stock codes to your stock code. And what that allows you to do is RightScan can then scan your supplier's barcode and automatically know that it equals your internal stock code as well. So that's one other thing to think about. Another big question when you're identifying whether to use supplier barcodes or not is, are they consistent among suppliers? Do you have some consistency with that? Often, are you receiving the same stock code from multiple suppliers with different types of labels? Is that a situation that you're in? Do all suppliers provide the required information that you need, or do some send you the correct labels and some don't send you the correct labels? You really want to think about keeping a consistent process for your workers and making sure that it's consistent to make decisions. One of the things to keep in mind, will operators in the warehouse understand how to decipher the difference on those supplier labels if I have the same product coming from multiple suppliers and one label needs to be relabeled and the other one's just fine to keep? The other thing to keep in mind is, will the operator know that they're using or moving the correct stock code throughout their warehouse? Does that supplier label have all of the information that they need to make a decision and use that throughout the organization? Often, in my own opinion, I'm not a big proponent to using supplier labels over printing your own. Some of the scenarios above can lead to issues in creating a consistent and accurate process when you don't have control over your own barcodes and labels in your organization. Using your own labels really saves you a lot more time and money that may be visible at the forefront in training your employees on how to scan or consume those barcodes and labels. If suppliers change something on their label, it doesn't impact your business processes anymore. And the other big thing is just keeping overall consistency and accuracy downstream through each of the different processes that that barcode or label is going to be consumed, whether it's raw materials or picking. Keeping that consistent label and format really helps with that. So the most important step you can take to achieve a more accurate inventory and future stock takes or cycle counts is to consistently label your warehouse and inventory with those barcodes that we were speaking about. I spoke earlier briefly about the differences between 1D and 2D barcodes. And on screen here, we have two examples of how users would create a 1D or 2D label. You're going to notice the difference between the barcodes on each of these labels. And in the 1D example on the left of the screen, you'll notice that there's a barcode for the stock code and there's a barcode for the lot number. In this situation, an operator would scan both barcodes to perform a transaction through RightScan. In the 2D example on the right, that single barcode actually contains all three pieces of data to the right of it. In this situation, an operator would scan the 2D barcode and use Smart Scan, and all three pieces of data would be fulfilled into the system through one scan to perform a transaction versus the multiple in the example on the left. So there's also a few other benefits indirectly that come with moving to 2D barcodes, and it saves the space on the label as well. Your scanners are better at detecting that 2D barcode much faster, and it can also be scanned easier at longer distances or unique angles from a scanner perspective. Now, keep in mind as we talk about 1D and 2D barcodes, RightScan is still compatible with both of those types of barcodes as long as your handheld is as well. And some of the latest scanners are much more powerful and lightweight and can scan more accurately and efficient at these longer distances. And that's one of the upsides of using those 2D barcodes if you're going through that label process and defining what you want your label to look like. Two of the most critical process points to automate the label printing are at the time of initial PO receiving and then when you're doing job receiving to bring finished goods back into inventory as well. One of the benefits of using RightScan is you can automate the printing process directly with the transactions for each of these that are occurring in real time through RightScan. So for example, when you're doing PO receiving and I receive my PO through RightScan, let's say, for example, I have 2 lines on it that I'm receiving in, and I receive that through RightScan, it's going to also automate that label printing of the labels for the 2 lines that I just received. And that's what creates that standardized process throughout your warehouse workflows to print those labels and keep that label consistency. Another scenario to consider that often kind of goes overlooked for consistent labeling processes is if I have quantities on my label. And I have situations that partials will be used with that specific process. So often we face that question of should we barcode the quantity or not on my label, or keep that as a manual entry field? And you can go either direction. And really what it comes down to as we look at that process is specifically in situations where you're going to be dealing with partials and consuming partials in your inventory. So often the scenario that comes to mind is raw materials that are being issued to a job. You might have a pallet or a crate that has a quantity of 100 on it, but when you're consuming part of that pallet or part of that crate, and now your quantity is down to 50, you have to think about now what is that process for relabeling that product and also updating the quantity barcode that's associated to it. And there's a few different ways that customers approach this and how they want to relabel those products when you're dealing with those partial processes. The first question is, do I need to create a new label for the product just from an ad hoc process? So for example, in RightScan, you have the ability to print ad hoc labels, and you can update those quantities on those labels and put that new label on the product when a partial is consumed. Another simple way, which isn't as recommended, but I've seen customers do, is they just cross out the quantity on the barcode label and manually rewrite it so that quantity barcode can't be consumed anymore, and now the manually written number on there is the new number to be used. The other way that you'd really want to look at, this is probably the most recommended way, is creating an automated process that's going to guide you through generating a new label when that partial is consumed. So for example, if it's a job issue and you're consuming part of a pallet, having the option to reprint a new label for that product right when you're doing the job issue transaction, for example, through RightScan. So now that we've talked about the barcoding process and getting your warehouse ready to be labeled and what that looks like, let's talk about now how that stock take or cycle count process is going to look with the solution. So you've now barcode labeled your inventory and you're ready to automate your next stock take or cycle count. And we've broken it into 6 high-level steps, which we'll go through each of these steps in more detail as well. The first step in the process is going to run your stock take selection out of Syspro to find what you're counting. Once you've done that, you're going to print your tickets or assign your areas or products to specific team members on what they're going to be counting. This is when RightScan kicks in, and you're going to now actually go and capture those counts via scanning in real time through those handheld devices with RightScan. Once you're done with that, with all your counters out there and they're done counting, you're going to review your variance reports out of Cispro to review that information. Of course, you're going to have to recount and resolve those discrepancies because you know you're still going to find those discrepancies with inventory. The last step in the process is to actually accept the stock take in Cispro, which is going to make the adjustment to inventory at that time. So let's break these down a little bit further and kind of walk through what each of these looks like. So as a supervisor or warehouse manager, you're going to begin your stock take selection in Cispro, and this is where you're going to define the parameters for what you're counting, whether it's by warehouse, bin locations, stock codes, etc. There's ways to break that down on what's going to be counted. Now, once you've defined your parameters, you're going to select Start Processing. And if you're using tickets out of Cispro, you're going to print those stock take tickets as well at this point in time. So now that you've started that process, you're going to disperse your stock take tickets or list to your employees based on that, on what they're going to be counting. One of the key things not to forget is to train your team and spend enough time upfront training your team on the correct counting processes and how to handle certain situations that you know they're going to face when they're out there counting and performing those counts on the warehouse floor. Stock take discrepancies often stem from mistraining and basic miscounts or selecting the incorrect unit of measure or recounting the same product. So sure you spend enough time training your team on the count procedures and what that process looks like. So when your inventory is now barcode label, you're moving from labor intensive, inaccurate manual counts and data entry to quickly barcode scanning that capture data for your physical count that's actually sent into Syspro immediately in real time. So there's no more going through that process of manually writing down pick tickets. Somebody then has to take those tickets that get handed in, try to read the handwriting, and then spend time manually putting that into an Excel sheet or manually keying that into Cispro. RightScan replaces that process and handles it through barcode scanning and real time sending that information to Cispro. RightScan makes it very easy to perform that physical count. So to begin the process, the operator is going to launch RightScan on your device and they're going to log in and start the cycle count or select the stock take icon on the handheld device to begin the counting process. So now that they've done that, they're going to perform the physical count. They're going to scan or enter their warehouse and their bin location if you're multi-bin, and then they're going to scan the stock code, perform the count. So they're going to count how many are there and enter that into the quantity field. Now, if it's a lot traceable item, for example, they're going to scan or enter the lot number associated with the stock code. If you use serial numbers, you'll also be prompted to scan each of the serial numbers that are being counted. One of the benefits of using RightScan is all of that is validated in real time. So you're not getting missed data into Cispro. RightScan's validating to make sure all of the information that's required is collected right at the time that that operator is performing that count. One of the other benefits with RightScan is you can set up a reference field to capture the user that's performing the count or scan for that specific transaction. And what this allows you to do is within Syspro, now you can go back and verify who performed a specific count. So to resolve any sort of inventory discrepancies that were found, now you have some sort of trail of who to go to try to resolve that inventory discrepancy and that information. After you've counted now and scanned the required information, the operator is going to post this data, which sends that directly into Cispro. So RightScan uses the E.net business objects, and this is what allows us to truly provide that seamless integration to Cispro in real time. This means you don't have to wait for that data anymore to be manually entered in Cispro. The data is captured right at that point in time. And that's what really results in a much more efficient and accurate stock take process than the manual workflows. So as the stock take's being performed as a warehouse manager or supervisor, you're able to run a stock take query in Cispro. And this is where you get to see the current status of the stock take results and check for discrepancies along the way. But upon actually completing the stock take capture process, so after everyone's done counting, a supervisor is able to run a stock take variance report from Cispro to display that full report of what was counted via RightScan versus what the system said we originally had recorded for inventory. And at this point, you may need to perform some recounts, or if everything looks as expected, you can accept that final stock take, which is going to make the adjustment to inventory at that point in time. Let's talk about some of the common reasons for stock take discrepancies and what leads to some of those stock take discrepancies that we find when going through that process. The first one is miscounts, and the discrepancy could be a result of a simple miscount while the operator was out there counting the products or in the original counting process. Another common one that we find is unit of measure, and perhaps the wrong unit of measure was used during the count, and for example, they used eaches instead of cartons or vice versa. You want to make sure that all of your people involved in the count are trained on those count procedures and somewhat on the products and units of measure. Another common one, and this is where RightScan really helps solve these mistakes, is a mistaken identity. The item could have been mistaken for a similar product. For example, if I have a red one and I have a pink one, they think they're the same stock code while they're going through that count process. With scanning, you don't have that issue anymore. But counting staff may not realize those differences in the products technically. So you want to keep in mind when performing your stock take that sometimes you're involving staff that is new to being in the warehouse, and they're not typically working in the warehouse on a day-to-day basis, working with those products. So making sure that you spend that time with training them on the products as well, or pairing them up with somebody that is in the warehouse on a day-to-day basis with that knowledge. Receiving it is another area. This is where the stock could have been received into inventory from the very beginning incorrectly. They could have recorded a count of 100 that they received when they really only received 10. With that being said, there could also be issues in that process with the labeling. So this isn't as common, but it's also possible that a product was labeled with the incorrect stock item label at that point in time as well. Another one we'll often run into is just a put away or a movement that caused a large number of items to be missing. You want to check to see if they were put in the wrong warehouse or the wrong bin location and verify that that wasn't really the stemming issue of that transaction of why they were missing. You'll also want to check to make sure that some sales orders have not been staged or allocated or moved temporarily while you're going through that stock take process. The last one is just our general stock loss. You'll find that a product broke in the warehouse, and rather than an employee or someone reporting that and adjusting inventory, they just threw it in the garbage. That's also going to lead to some of your general stock loss as well. So RightScan can really help you achieve greater inventory accuracy through this data validation during the stock take process, but as well as your everyday receiving of raw materials, performing warehouse movements, and picking sales orders. The data validation really begins with the use of barcodes that we spent the first half on throughout your warehouse. And barcodes are going to help validate the stock codes, the locations, lot numbers, serial numbers, and much more to really improve the operator's counting processes, as well as just their general performance on transactions throughout the warehouse. The solution really helps stop those errors from occurring right at the point of the transaction occurring on the warehouse floor versus having to go on a scavenger hunt a week later when the paperwork got turned in and you don't know why there's an error in inventory. And some of the other issues that you alleviate with a solution like RightScan is you don't have handwriting anymore. Trying to decipher somebody's handwriting to figure out, is that a 7 or is that a 1? Also, you don't have incorrectly entered stock codes. RightScan is validating that stock code information in real time through a barcode, which is being scanned, and that really helps increase that accuracy. One of the other common ones you'll find is capturing all the correct data right at the right time on the floor. RightScan is going to validate that it has all of the data that's required to perform a transaction before that's able to be posted in real time. And when we talk about real time, that resolves the data entry lag time that you might currently be facing in your organization, whether that's the lag time with your stock take process bottling up with somebody entering it in the front office, or if it's just your day-to-day transactions of movements as well. So now that we've talked about the process and the labels and how to get started, let's talk about some of our customers and what sort of results they've seen with implementing these processes and implementing RightScan. Magilite is a company, Meridian Industries. They're based out of Massachusetts, and the company manufactures and distributes high-performance material for upholstery and wall coverings. Magilite employs roughly 140 people and operates in a 165,000 square foot manufacturing facility. Their business challenge that they faced is each year Magilite does a massive annual inventory that requires double the staff to conduct. And it takes them a considerable amount of time and effort to conduct this. One of the benefits that they found with RightScan was that it was so easy to use, they could train temporary employees in less than 30 minutes. So Magilite actually purchases RightScan temporary licenses just for this specific time of the year when they're going through this stock take to do their annual inventory using RightScan. This really allows them to get more people on the floor at the same time and shorten that annual inventory and reduce their downtime from that perspective. Another customer is Loftness, which is based out of Hector, Minnesota. The company manufactures and distributes specialized attachments for vegetation management, snow blowers, grain bagging systems. They roughly employ 90 employees and operate in a 100,000 square foot facility. Their business challenge that they faced was each year their annual inventory would take up to 3 days or more using 22-person teams, using those handwritten sheets for counting. And then Loftness manually had to enter that data into Syspro to make the adjustments and correct the errors. After moving to RightScan, they moved from manual handwritten inventory of barcode scan to barcode scanning for those counts and updating Cispro in real time. And really what they've seen from this is they've seen a big time savings in eliminating that time lag from after hours keying of the inventory counts that were counted during the day. And then the annual inventory went from lasting more than 3 days down to a day and a half with only a small team of 6 to 8 people. So they reduced their inventory duration by 50% and their labor hours by 80%. This really also increased their accuracy of their inventory and allowed them to ultimately move to cycle counting versus having to do that annual stock take. With that being said, we're going to adjust and move over to any questions that came in.
All right, Ryan. So the first question we have today is from Charles. His question is RightScan compatible with both the Cispro stock take function and the cycle count program that was newly released with Cispro 8?
So RightScan is currently compatible with the stock take module out of Cispro. It's not necessarily compatible with the new cycle count module out of Cispro 8. I guess I have not seen that module yet. I'll have to do a little bit more research into that to get back to you on that one as well.
All right, the next question we have is, what label software do you recommend?
Recommend. That's a very good question. So I'll go with the most common ones that we work with. So most commonly we're working with Bartender or Nice Label. Which one is my personal preference? They're so close to each other these days that I don't really have a personal preference, but we often see that Bartender and Nice Label are the most commonly ones that we'll work with to automate those label printing process and label designs.
All right. The next question is, does RightScan support 2D barcodes?
Yes, so RightScan supports both 1D and 2D barcodes, but really it comes down to the handheld device that you're using. So most of all of the newer devices that you're looking at for handhelds are going to be 2D compatible. Some of the older devices like the Motorola and Symbol 9190s, they're often only 1D compatible. So it really comes down to the device that you're using, whether it's 1D or 2D compatible. But yes, RightScan works with both of those.
All right, so I think we'll do 2 more questions here. The next one is, how does RightScan handle multiple units of measure for inventory during stock takes?
So with multiple units of measure, by default, RightScan is going to use your stocking unit of measure for those stock take transactions when you're posting that data. You do have the option in the setup to allow certain users to be able to navigate between multiple units of measure. So for example, if you want them to be able to choose whether they're case counting by eaches, or if you have an alternate unit measure set up for cases as well, you can provide them the option to select the unit of measure that they're counting in on the floor. Now, often we find that you want to keep as much consistency as possible. So giving that decision or making a decision ahead of time on the unit of measure that's going to be counted is often more recommended, but there's scenarios where you still provide that flexibility to your users.
Okay, and so the last question here is, does RightScan adjust inventory when it posts to Cispro during a stock take?
So when you're using the stock take module out of Syspro and RightScan, it's not adjusting that inventory during the actual count process. So what's happening from a system perspective is RightScan sending all of that count data to Syspro, whether you have one operator out there counting or 20 operators out there counting. It's going to send all of that information into Syspro. And then at that point in time, you're going to run your variance report. And that is when you accept the stock take to actually make the adjustments to inventory at that point in time. Any other questions, or was that the last of them?
I believe that was the last one.
Perfect. Well, thank you everyone for attending, and hopefully you were able to learn a few little things. Everyone, as we go through these times, please stay safe and stay healthy, and we appreciate you joining the webinar today.